All right, well, thank you all for coming on this wintry night. My name is Barry Stapleton, Director of the Ward Irish Music Archives and Entertainment staff here. Welcome to CelticMKE. This is actually our 9th Chuck Ward lecture. Partnership with UWM, the Center for Celtic Studies at UWM. It was started with after Chuck Ward died. Chuck was an entertainment director at Milwaukee Irish Fest. He was in the band Blarney, and he enjoyed telling stories through the band and history and everything like that. So this is a lecture series that we put together that does the same thing in a different way. Our thanks to Barbara and the Celtic Studies program from UWM. They have they really need you to sign up and back. Please sign up, put your email down so that they can keep you in touch with all of their events. So this year we have Ray Cashman. He's a professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University. He's the director of the Folklore Institute, which actually I believe is the largest folklore institute in the country. And I believe it is celebrated 50 years or somewhere around there. Yeah, okay. And editor of the Journal of Folklore Research. He's the author of Storytelling on the Northern Irish Border, which explores the kind of stories told at wakes in County Tyrone. Also of Packy Jim, Folklore and Worldview on the Irish Border, which explores the oral traditions of Donegal storyteller Packy Jim McGrath. So Ray will give his lecture, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So please welcome Ray Cashman.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. I really appreciate this invitation. I want to thank Barbara and everybody at the Center for Celtic Studies at UWM. I want to thank Barry and everybody here at CelticMKE. I want to thank Barry in particular for all the hospitality and the transportation, and especially for the look under the hood upstairs, to have a look at this fantastic music archives here. This is just an amazing resource. I know I have 5 or 6 graduate students working on Irish cultural issues who may be in touch soon. So this is a wonderful resource. I'm glad to make this connection. I'm sorry it's taken so long to do so. I also want to say that I am honored and humbled to be offering the Chuck Ward Memorial Lecture. This lectureship, not necessarily my lecture, but this lectureship is such a fitting tribute to a man who is so civically minded and so deeply invested in community, which of course is one of the themes of the talk tonight. I can't help but also think that not just about where we are together right now, but when we are together. Of course, here we are the day after Samhain, Ihe Hauna, Halloween. Here we are on the night of All Saints. Here we are the day before All Souls. As you know, members of the tribe, this of course is one of the most appropriate and resonant times of year to remember those who've gone before us. And so I want to remember and honor Chuck Ward. I want to also remember and honor Ed Ward and offer my condolences that he passed away so recently. I will say something that will be no surprise to all of you. I'm sure that those 2 men and the extended Ward family would be so proud of this institution. And I would bet good money that everybody in this room has, to some extent, played a role in stewarding their legacy. So as they say, thank you for your service, and I'm very happy to be some small part of this. So again, thanks for the invitation. Now, you're expecting a lecture. And I'm going to give you one. Let me give you an idea of what to anticipate. About 45 minutes of talk with some visuals and some video. And where we're going, I'm hoping will be entertaining. That is to say, we'll be talking about some weird things. There'll be witchcraft. There'll be fairies. There'll be the evil eye. There'll be something called the hungry grass. All of this will be explained. But before we get there, I need to do a little bit of a wind-up, a little bit of context to justify why we're even talking about these things in the first place. I can tell you that, as Barry says, I'm a folklorist. I'm one with a long connection with Ireland, starting with just a glorious junior year abroad at University College Cork, Fado, Fado, Fado. I won't tell you when it was. And then language study in the summer, and then field work in places like County Tyrone and Donegal and Fermanagh, and more recently Cork and Kerry. And when I'm giving talks in Ireland and closer to home, I've found again and again that people actually already have a pretty good idea of what sort of things count as folklore. Stories about things that happened in this place in the past, or songs about love and war and life and death, or customs and beliefs and rituals and observances. All of these sorts of things can count as folklore. You have these sorts of things in mind, and with these sorts of things in mind, I want to start the talk with a proposition. It's not a new proposition, but it's a proposition that a lot of the stuff that we have termed folklore serves people as a kind of vernacular social theory. All right, egghead academic, what do you mean by that? All I mean by that is that much of the stuff that we have called folklore over time serves as a means through which people represent themselves to themselves, a means through which people think about what it is to be an individual in a group, often in the midst of change. Now, many examples of traditional Irish culture would illustrate this. Let's take Irish fairy legends for a brief example of what I mean by folklore serving as vernacular social theory. In an elaborate web of inherited stories, the fairies, the good people, the Dinna Usul, the fairies comprise a society parallel to our own. They steal from us young children full of potential, wise midwives, talented musicians and athletes, those people and things we value or aspire to become. They also intrude into our world to reward good behavior or punish unneighborly transgression, removing a hunchback's hump for his modesty and reverence, crippling a man who interferes with a fairy thorn tree. More than that, the fairies' other world offers a removed but relevant realm through which to explore difference, desire, fate and fortune, the normal and the abnormal, and other potentially disturbing issues that are often difficult to articulate directly, as we will see. As Angela Burke observes, the otherness of fairies invites us to explore, I'm quoting her, to explore the mysterious, the marginal, and the ambiguous, whether in time, in the landscape, or indeed in our social relationships. And all of this makes the fairies important cognitive tools or metaphors, depending on your interpretation, but important tools for contemplating the nature of self and society. So, telling, listening to, and internalizing fairy legends is just one example of the kind of everyday practices that inform and shape our orientations, our values, our expectations about how to live in a group, how not to behave as well. And we acquire these orientations and values through shared practices that evolve in response to shared conditions over time in a given social environment. Quite often, folklore both reflects and instills enduring conceptions of that shared social environment. Or put one more way, many examples of folklore serve as a shared way of thinking through the nature of community, its workings, its vulnerability, its viability. Of course, this begs the question, what is community? In a very real sense, there is no such thing as community. Community is an idea, and like all ideas, it is culturally relative. It may vary from culture to culture, and it does not exist except through its enactment. How community is enacted offers us a window into the community logics of a given group of people. And if we're interested in a traditional idea of community in Irish context, well, we find plenty of evidence in ethnographic research. Take, for example, Henry Glassey's work on folklore and daily life in Ballymonone, County Fermanagh, in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. Focusing on everyday acts of reciprocal hospitality, entertainment, and labor sharing, Glassey derives an insider's understanding of community defined not by space, as in everybody within a given townland or parish constitutes a community. No, by participation. Community is defined by participation, by social networks of willing participants bound not by affection, and certainly not by shared politics, but rather by a social contract for mutual support, a social contract sanctified in the Christian injunction to love one's neighbor as oneself. That said, of course, individuals have agency, they have free will, and they are capable of opting out of community, thus conceived, as we'll see. But this generally held understanding of community as an ideal is clear in ethnographic accounts of rural agrarian life in Ireland from before Conrad Ahrensberg's work in County Clare of the 1930s, through Glassey's work, through, I would say, my own work in counties Tyrone, Donegal, and more recently Cork. If I'm adding anything new tonight, it's a slight shift in focus to emphasize examples of Irish folklore that pinpoint threats to community and suggest how such threats can be diminished or overcome. Now, although my examples will be diverse, they reveal a long-standing commitment to unstinting generosity and reciprocity. Likewise, the flip side of that commitment seems to be a deep-seated ambivalence toward money, profit, and ambition in a world of limited good. With that phrase, in a world of limited good, I'm invoking anthropologist George Foster's 1965 observation that in the vernacular social theory of many societies, that is, in the community logics of many societies, we find a shared belief that there is a finite amount of good in the world, so that one person's gain entails another's loss. Such a perspective reinforces a conception of community as a social contract for mutual aid, a charter for continual reciprocation. The prospect of community, then, is threatened by any breach of that social contract, including the efforts of any person to advance his or her own interests, which is understood to come inherently at the expense of others. Now imagine how such a conception of community might fare during a time and place of intense pressure and competition. Imagine Ireland in the mid-19th century, when famine and disease ensured that good in the world had never been more limited. The second half of my talk will focus on folklore that emerges in the wake of the famine and what this lore may tell us about the prospect of community in extreme circumstances. But first, let's proceed anecdotally. We'll start in the near present and we'll work our way backward in time. I want to see where a string of vignettes and associations take us in a meditation on the nature of community, its viability and vulnerability. In 1999, I walked in Mclaughlин's small electronics shop in Castledurg, County Tyrone. I bought a dual cassette recorder in order to make copies of field recordings for people who had helped me during early field work in Ireland. Now, Michael knew me. We had been neighbors for several months, and honestly, that's why I went to his shop, even though I might have found a better price had I gone to Oma or Strabane or Derry. So I paid Michael's advertised price in cash. He handed me back the correct amount of change from the till, and then as I thanked him and turned to leave, Michael said, "Hang on a wee minute." He reached into his pocket, and he handed me a £1 coin. "What's this?" I said. "A Lux penny," he said. L-U-C-K-S, penny. "What's a Lux penny?" I asked. "I don't know, just a custom we have," he said, unhelpfully. "Well, all right." Later, I asked my near neighbor, Danny Gallen. You see him here? I asked him about the custom, and he said, at fairs in the recent past, the buyer and seller of livestock would haggle to determine a mutually agreeable price, and then the seller would be expected to give back some small amount of the profit, depending on the value of the animal sold. A luck penny could be offered in other situations as well. Anytime there is a monetary exchange for goods and services, and obviously it's not always just a penny. It depends on the value of what's being haggled for. But I quote Danny from a recorded conversation. He says, they talk about luck, keeping the luck flowing, but it's also a way of keeping that connection going. See, you're not going to go back to that man if you think he's taken advantage. But you might if he's decent with you. That's an important idea, decency, and I'll come back to it. The Lux penny, Danny continues, the Lux penny back is a way of saying that the two men have a kind of partnership and might do business again at another fair, end quote. So in a sense, that custom deflects attention from the purely financial aspects of the transaction. It's interesting. The Lux penny also points to a kind of anxiety over the negative reciprocity that's inherent in capitalism. After all, this is a system in which a seller competes not just with the market, but also with the buyer, trying to maximize profit at the buyer's expense. In terms used by anthropologist Marshall Solins, my transaction with Michal started out more or less as balanced reciprocity. That is to say, two things of roughly equal value being exchanged, in this case money, for an item sold. Then, with the Lux penny, the transaction ended with a dash of what we could call generalized reciprocity. Generalized reciprocity involves a gift being offered without any expectation of an immediate return, but with a vague expectation of reciprocation in the indefinite future. It's a bid to establish or maintain a relationship. Even more interesting, perhaps, after explaining the Lux penny, Danny then shifted to discuss other local economic habits and customs. So, for example, Danny mentioned that he has a tab at certain shops in his rural parish of Ahiarn and in the nearby town of Castlederg, mostly shops run by neighbors and relatives. And even though he might be in a position to pay off all of his debts, it would be taken as an unmannerly, unfriendly, and unneighborly act. Now that stumped me. Hang on a second. How could a shopkeeper be offended by being paid what he's owed? I asked Danny, and he says because it's not about the money. He didn't say stupid, but he meant that, right? He continues, well, it is if we're talking about a lot of money. You can't be in big debt, but having a little debt is expected. It's about the partnership. If I paid off my debts to Danny McHugh, that's a local shopkeeper, he'd think we were through, or that I'd be going somewhere else to buy meal and the odd loaf of bread, end quote. Well, to my surprise, the symbolic significance of debt and credit in the social networks of farmers and shopkeepers that Danny described was almost exactly what Conrad Ahrensberg described when I went back to reread his 1937 ethnography, The Irish Countryman. To Danny Gallen's surprise, a few years later, shopkeeper Danny McHugh, remember him? He stopped by and handed him a final bill. The two Dannys had had a falling out and failed to reconcile. So when Danny McHugh took the nuclear option, as it were, he ended that relationship by calling in all debts. So with those examples in mind, community starts to look like a web of mappable, interconnecting, mutually beneficial transactional partnerships and networks that are continually maintained, renegotiated, or in some cases terminated. Now, I was prepared for this vision of community by labor and equipment swapping arrangements known by various terms such as swapping or neighboring or joining or cooring. Likewise, the same understanding of community is enacted after work is done through traditions such as mumming, or through the assembly of all near and far neighbors at wakes, regardless of sectarian and other divides. But before the Lux penny conversation, I hadn't considered the unstated yet apparently widely understood mutual obligations established through debt and credit. In some ways, money changes everything. We've already seen more than a hint of apprehension about this slippery, compoundable, potentially exploitative market phenomenon, money. Michal Gallen's Lux penny was a gesture at redefining the event that brought us together in social terms rather than merely financial terms. But in other ways, perhaps money changes none of the underlying community logics that maintain neighborly equilibrium through carefully orchestrated reciprocity. In fact, in the case of the Lux penny, money affords a kind of dramatization of community in order to resolve some of the ambivalence that money provokes. Let's turn to another vignette. In 2014, I was walking to the house of my friend Packy Jim McGraw. He lived at the time on an isolated farm in the Lettercran area near Pettigo, County Donegal. On the way, I saw a notice on a gate that declared tests were being conducted to determine the feasibility of erecting electricity-generating windmills in the area. Naturally enough, when I got to his house, I asked Packy Jim about what's going on. His main concern was the inevitable conflicts that arise when a wind farm company offers one landowner a lucrative leasing arrangement and less or nothing to a neighboring landowner. And more than that, it takes relatively little for people on adjoining land to object and wreck a neighbor's deal with these companies. So acting as he normally does as a kind of auto-ethnographer, as a kind of vernacular social critic, Packy Jim assessed the situation as follows. Here he is in his element. Old jealousy, he says. Old jealousy because somebody's getting a couple of quid out of it. I'm telling you, old jealousy, that's the Irish for you. It's running away from father to son to grandfather to great-grandfather, all the way back for 1,000 years, I would think. Running through the bloodstream or the genetics or whatever the hell you'd like to call it, but that's what I would think, end quote. He's quite a character. You'll get to hear from him in a second. Now, as our conversation unfolded, Packy Jim made a connection to the evil eye, also known as blinking in this part of the world, which he describes as a jealous look that can drain the luck or prosperity from other people or their possessions. He illustrated this with a story concerning a local man known as Black Henry McCutcheon, who was accused of having the evil eye. An oddball, a mama's boy, a Protestant in a largely Catholic district, McCutcheon was falsely accused, according to Packy Jim. But after rumors compounded and one of his neighbors fabricated the deaths of 2 young calves, said to have wasted away from the evil eye, McCutcheon was stigmatized and shunned. So with treachery and neighborly discord a clearly established theme, Packy Jim then launched into what turned out to be a localized version of a migratory legend that is known also, well, throughout Ireland, also in Britain, Scandinavia, Germany, and parts of North America. His story featured a named local man said to be a witch who, as witches do, transforms into a hare to steal milk by suckling a neighbor's cow. In doing so, the witch hopes to magically acquire the cow's dairy output for the year, and particularly the butterfat content necessary for churning butter, traditionally a reliable source of income. Upon discovering the witch in the form of a hare in his byre, however, the cow's owner shoots the hare, and later the witch's identity is revealed when he transforms back into human form with a telltale wound. You may not be able to read the captions here, but what you're looking at, details of a fresco from a 15th century church in Sweden, where you see the hare suckling the cow and the devil in the background. An illustration from a more recent collection of Scandinavian folktales in North America. Same idea. Let's hear Packy Jim's version. Now, 2 things about this. First, I want to apologize for the quality of the video. It's not good. I did not have a great camera. This is a guy who lives without electricity or running water, or he did so at the time. He's also a little stingy with the turf. He didn't have on a fire that day. So the only light you're getting, Chiaroscuro style, is over his shoulder from the window. But he was in the mood, so I'm taking the video, right? The other thing is that this is a guy with hundreds upon hundreds of stories polished in his repertoire. This story, however, was new to him. That is to say, a neighbor of his had recently told him this. So this isn't as polished a story. We're getting a kind of a draft, but let's hear what he has to say. I'm gonna skip some of the sensitive information about who knows who lives where and is related to whom.
George about the family. Mickey Gallagher, Irish woman, all the both were supposed to be witches. Taking the milk off neighbours, away from neighbours' cows. So Willie McHugh's story is, old Josie Dennison that lived at the back of the scribe, back there where the quarry is, old Josie Dennison lived there, him and his sister Mattie. Lived there, brother and sister. And Mickey Gallagher was known to be dangerous for taking the milk off your cows. And old Josie Denison had a muzzle-loading gun. And he had powder, but he had no hair. He had powder, no hair. And then you put in the powder, there was a cap that was put in or some damn thing. And then there was the powder put in. And then there was some piece of paper put in. And then the hair was put in. And then there was another piece of paper put in front. And then you were ready then for your shooting. So, he had no hail for his gun. So, he decided on another method. He put in his cap, he put in his powder, he put in a piece of paper, and he put in a silver threepenny bit. And then he put in a piece of paper again, and then he was ready for action. So according to the story, he was outside about the door. He had his cow or his cows in the byre. I don't know whether he was looking out for this outfit or not anyway. I don't know. But by God, he sees the hare going out of the byre door. He races for his gun and he fired at the hare. The hare gave a screech, but she went on. And the next thing happened, the doctor was summoned from Castlederg, and he landed up to Scrahay to treat Mickey Gallagher for a wound somewhere on the body. If you're interested in that story more fully, maybe you are and maybe you're not.
I am.
If you contact Willie McHugh, he might be able to, as I say, will put the thing quite differently for you. But that is the story that he fired at the hare. The hare gave a screech but went on. And then the next day, the doctor from Castlederg was summoned up to treat Mickey Gallagher for a wound on his body somewhere. That's the story. And I didn't hear that until of late, inside maybe the last 12 or 14 months. Willie McHugh, as the thing, will tell me that story. Well, that was new to me.
Interesting. Note that not long after telling the story, Packy Jim followed this witch hare story with a childhood memory of a local woman named Mrs. Turner, who had a widespread reputation for hospitality. Packy Jim and his mother used to pay Mrs. Turner a small sum to breed their turkey hens with her male turkey, and then Mrs. Turner, in turn, would offer them a small gift, such as tea or sugar or tobacco, over and above the exchange itself, which is a kind of luxpenny. Now, during one visit, Packy Jim remembers Mrs. Turner talking about a neighbor woman, Alice Monaghan, whom she suspected of envy and witchcraft. According to Mrs. Turner, one day she spotted a suspicious hare in her farmyard that bared its teeth at her. And in response, she belted out a chant-like anti-charm. Hares and witches and dirty butter. Hares and witches and dirty butter. Hares and witches and dirty butter, until the hare left. And she said she had no more trouble from Alice Monaghan after that. I don't doubt. Well, note that I'm treating in the same category Packy Jim's two witch hare stories and his evil eye story, and to some extent even the contemporary gossip and wrangling about wind farms, because they all speak to the same constellation of concerns. A common factor here is anxiety arising from a conflict of economic interests, and especially from the difficult balance to be struck between personal gain and community well-being. Drawing from a similar corpus of stories concerning witchcraft and supernatural aggression in Ballymonone, County Fermanagh, Henry Glassy derives a set of principles concerning prosperity and profit. The basic local understanding is that making a living requires intelligence and hard work, but this is not enough to make one rich. There are two paths to wealth: both of which require something more. One path involves evil, specifically witchcraft, which may be characterized as the use of magic to circumvent hard work and intelligence, gaining an easy profit at the expense of your neighbors. The other path requires luck and the continued application of intelligence and hard work during the good times, which are not necessarily deserved or earned, but bestowed by God nonetheless. So to be a witch is to steal and to advance one's interests at the expense of others, opting out of community and disrupting community equilibrium. To be a member of community is to share the profits of and extend the circulation of luck. Note that Mrs. Turner is the opposite of her witch nemesis Alice Monaghan in giving Packy Jim's mother a great quantity of tea in a time of scarcity. Mrs. Turner is open-handed beyond the obligations of her financial transaction. Note also that anxiety over profit may revolve logically around the dairy. Now, to explain, milk is the product of God-given natural resources, and the butter churned from it is sold for a profit to outside parties, not unlike the wind-powered electricity sold to urban suppliers. With butter, the ideal counterbalance to the destabilization of profit is to share that gift within the community in symbolically crucial acts of hospitality and reciprocity during social visits, during ceilidhs, during wakes. This blunts the excessive gain of purely self-serving, profit-driven enterprise. As yet, there is no equivalent line of reasoning, ritual, or custom to settle the current wind farm wars, but whether one reaps profit from wind or from rain, grass, and cows, profit in itself is not considered wrong. The problem is profit that is ill-gotten and selfishly used. It is dirty butter from which nothing good can come. And it connects conceptually to many other forms of ill-fated profiteering. Let's briefly cast further back in space and backward in time to the late 19th century and Ballyvadley, County Tipperary. In her engrossing book, The Burning of Bridget Cleary, I highly recommend this book, Angela Burke observes that the striving, upwardly mobile ways of one Bridget Cleary were perceived by her family and neighbors as her privileging short-term personal gain over long-term familial and community stability. More than that, her uppity ways were taken as evidence of her association with the fairies and supernatural profiteering, which in turn fueled the abuse that ended in her death when she was burned as a fairy changeling. Such preoccupations with legitimate and illegitimate ways of creating profit seem to have been around for some time, and not just on the Irish border. More broadly, the evidence from Castlederg, Achiarn, Lettercran, Ballymonone, Ballyvadley, it points us back to the long-standing postulate that this is a world of limited good, decidedly different from the American dream of unlimited opportunity. In such a system, a lux penny makes sense. It's a small symbolic return of profit, keeping it in circulation, blunting the unlucky negative reciprocity inherent in capitalism, and it helps maintain interconnected webs of cooperation. Ambition and profit are both provocative and potentially threatening to the viability of community in a world of limited good. And folklore, through time, across space, bears witness to people being well aware of and actively resisting such threats to community. Now, in a kinder world, this is where I would move toward a conclusion. But the fact is, everything I've said so far is really just a setup for where we're actually going. As I hinted at earlier, my main purpose isn't actually to talk about Lux pennies and butter witches. My main purpose is to talk about the famine. Or more specifically, I want to use these preceding examples, gradually working backward in time, to talk about enduring ideas that revolve around the prospect of community as an ideal, a prospect that was never more threatened than during the Great Hunger of the mid-19th century. Shocking, traumatic, almost untellable, the famine was nothing if not a devastating blow to the traditional concept of community described here. Now, you, this audience, need no lecture from me about the famine, but certain facts bear repeating. In terms relevant to the community logics discussed here, neighbors were pitted against neighbors as the lower classes were forced to compete over dwindling food supplies and eventually to avoid each other altogether as disease spread. To make matters worse, a striving merchant class, derisively referred to as gombeen men, profited from rising prices and exploitative money-lending practices. The government in London strictly adhered to laissez-faire economics, treated the famine as a market correction, and provided no aid in the beginning and virtually no effective aid by the end. And in the aftermath, large farmers consolidated capital in the form of cheap, newly available land, compounding their profits for generations to come. As Brendan McSivna observes in his recent masterful history, The End of Outrage, market-driven inequality and individualism had already been on the rise by the eve of the famine. But the severity of the famine bred unprecedented callousness and ushered in an era of infidelity to much of what the dead held dear. McSivna is delicate but astute in raising the uncomfortable truths that not all survivors were victims, and that what may be most characteristic of the famine are those gray zones of human raggedness, complicity, and failure. Failure to live by long-established imperatives of reciprocity and neighborliness. For many, remembering the famine in the aftermath must have evoked ambivalence at best, if not actual shame, and in some cases silence. In all likelihood, I will never know, for example, the circumstances under which my father's people left Kilveelaton townland, Glentan Parish, near Mallow, County Cork, in 1850. But the details, however black and white, are bound to blur in the zones of gray McSivna describes. So how do we even approach the famine, its representation, its conceptualization, whether through folklore, literature, historiography, some other means or medium? The answer, in short, is indirectly, as you may already know. The folkloric record should offer the unofficial grassroots perspective. And it's not that it's so much silent as it's enigmatic. It requires special interpretive efforts to hear. In large part, legends and oral traditions representing the famine are fragmentary, coded, indirect, opaque. But if folklore provides models for contemplating and replicating ideas about the nature of community, it stands to reason that folklore could also bear witness, however indirectly, to the haunting consequences of abandoning community. Bear with me. For centuries, there have been recorded accounts of people traveling over particular spots in the landscape and being overcome by sudden weakness and, most of all, an insatiable hunger. The hunger and lethargy associated is said to be severe enough to kill the victim, but he or she can be cured by eating even a small bite of food, or failing that, chewing on something such as shoe leather and swallowing the juices. The hungry grass, or unfair gorta, names both the ordeal and the culprit. Such an extraordinary bodily somatic experience, linked to particular locations, it makes for remarkable narratives that circulate still. Just last summer, I recorded a first-hand account of experiencing the hungry grass from Donny O'Sullivan of Lombardstown, County Cork, and another second-hand account from John Joe Kavanagh of Drumahan, County Cork. In addition to contemporary accounts, archival materials, particularly those collected by the Irish Folklore Commission, include personal experiences, legends, discussions of precautions and cures, and belief statements that identify the origin of the hungry grass, an origin usually taken to be supernatural, about which more in a moment. But consider a typical example of a brief third-person account recorded in Buncrana, County Donegal, from an elderly man interviewed for the Irish Folklore Commission's 1938 Schools Collection Project. Quoting it, he says, "People used to get fair gorta, or get weak coming home from markets and fairs. This grass, if you walk on it, you will not be able to go any further without eating something. There's fair gorta at Mamore, at Slavery, and at many other places. There's hungry grass about a mile from Clonamany, next to this parish. If anyone walks over it, they get weak. My grandfather, William Mclaughlin of Carva, said one day he and a young man were coming from Clonamani, and the man got weak at this spot, and my father had a few cakes in his pocket, and he gave them to the man to eat, and he got all right again. But any person going to Clonamani always took a piece of oat bread with them for fear the hungry grass might overcome them at this spot. End quote. Now, even in such a short text, we have all the basic elements of severe hunger and weakness experienced at a certain place. More than a setting, this place triggers the phenomenon, which may be cured only by ingesting something, however minimal. In addition, there's mention of the custom that people in the past, being aware of the risk of the hungry grass, regularly carried food with them on journeys, usually small oat cakes or biscuits, a motif that reemerges time and again in hungry grass lore. Now, note that the informant here, William Mclaughlin, the same name as his grandfather, he was 86 years old when this account was recorded in 1938. That means he was born at the very end of the famine. And as you might expect, there are connections between the hungry grass and the famine to explore. But the fact is, reports of the hungry grass pre-exist the 19th century famine. The event William Mclaughlin describes, if it happened in his grandfather's youth, would have taken place before the famine. Indeed, there are conceptual parallels to the hungry grass in William Camden's Historical Survey Britannia from 1610, and arguably in the Ulster cycle, which was set in the Iron Age but was written down starting in the 12th century. Still, the vast majority of written hungry grass sources, folkloric, literary, historical, they come after the famine, and as such, it may come as little surprise that the most common explanation, at least during this period, given these sources, is that the hungry grass occurs at the location where a victim of the famine died. The somatic experience of the hungry grass may be understood as a kind of re-experiencing. That is, the hungry grass experience is a matter of later unfortunates treading on a place of past tragedy and being made to feel the ravenous hunger and debilitating weakness of a famine victim just before he or she succumbed at that very spot. It's as if the grass growing over such a place preserves the imprint of that tragedy, and through some supernatural means, such as contagious magic, place becomes empowered to subject passers-by to the original victim's suffering. At such a spot, it is as if the progression of time halts, standing as still as place is immobile, leaving the famine tragedy to play on a continual loop, absorbing new participants who stray into this unfortunate place-time collision. Any instance of the hungry grass, then, is a spot in the landscape where time and place and event collapse into a kind of continual happening. Of course, there are other beliefs about the origin of the hungry grass, but upon examination, the surface differences may mask deeper structural similarities. The second most popular theory in the available materials credits the fairies. Back to the fairies we go. Credits the fairies with either planting the hungry grass or turning grass hungry, as it were, at any spot where people have eaten outdoors but have failed to leave a food offering or even let crumbs fall in tribute to the good people. As mentioned in the beginning, the fairies comprise a kind of alternative society parallel to our own, and countless fairy legends depict humans being rewarded for doing the fairies a good turn or being punished for crossing them. So the idea of the hungry grass being retribution from forsaken, discourteously treated fairies follows the same logic. If the social contract between humans in this world depends on unstinting generosity and reciprocity, so do mutually beneficial, peaceable human-fairy relationships in the world of narrative. Fairy legends, again, offer a removed but relevant realm through which to contemplate proper social values and the consequences of transgressing them. Now, perhaps the fairy explanation and the famine explanation of the hungry grass coexist because they're not necessarily in competition. They may overlap conceptually. Indeed, William Carleton carefully knits the two origin stories together in his short story Fair Gartha, or The Hungry Grass, published in Dublin University magazine in the wake of the famine. Both the fairy and the famine theories revolve around agents with whom no food is shared, and this causes a rupture and perhaps a permanent unluckiness in a world of limited good. In a world of limited good, open-handedness or decency, as Carleton's characters repeatedly refer to it, as Danny Gallen referred to it when explaining the Lux Penny, decency is required to keep luck in circulation and the bonds of community strong. Given that reports of the hungry grass predate the mid-19th century famine, perhaps the famine explanation is a novel iteration of an older constellation of ideas concerning the connections between fortune, reciprocity, decency, and community. Indeed, Neil O'Cusson, Cormac O'Grada, Cathal Porter, they all suggest that making the famine meaningful at all at the time and in subsequent generations, this required creative recycling of older, already meaningful representations of scarcity and social dissolution. It's possible that the severity of the mid-19th century famine would have required the invention of the hungry grass if it hadn't already existed, if it hadn't already been available for creative recycling as famine lore. Well, considering the hungry grass in the context of popular discourse about the famine, it expands our interpretive possibilities. It provides us a context for how the phenomenon was interpreted in the post-famine period. More than that, given the narrative difficulties of even representing the famine in the first place, the belief that the hungry grass was a result of famine deaths may speak volumes that cannot be expressed fully in a more direct or expository way. Perhaps what resonates most are gestures toward Muxivna's gray zones. Consider the post-famine narrators of hungry grass experiences. They had inherited a decimated world full of largely reticent, or at least very unnerved survivors. Reticent why? If I survived but my neighbors did not, could I have done something more for them? Was it the food that I stole from my family, or that I hid or refused to share, what made the difference between life and death for my neighbor in a world of limited good? Perhaps there's room to see something like a collective survivor's guilt at work in post-famine conceptions of the hungry grass. Such guilt would be collective on the part of the survivors themselves and of their descendants who would have inherited certain beliefs, customs, and ways of talking directly and indirectly about the undead past inscribed in the landscape that endures. So the experience of the hungry grass and its narration may predate the famine, but it is notable and telling that the dominant popular explanation connects it to the famine. It would seem that on some level, for some people, the hungry grass offers itself as a popular or vernacular means to remember and indirectly contemplate the social implications of the famine. Thinking of the somatic experience as a matter of feeling what famine victims felt, but neither I nor my ancestors who were spared felt, this may render the hungry grass a kind of famine starvation couvade. Here's a phenomenon that may be interpreted as a matter of experiencing vicariously, even empathetically. It's an experience perhaps like a penance, or at least an acknowledgement, that may help expiate the ambient, perhaps unspeakable sense of guilt among those who survived and their descendants. Maybe. This proposal, whatever its merits, brings to mind a moment at University College Cork a quarter of a century ago. I can't believe it's been that long, but I remember very well sitting in a class taught by the late Professor Donncha O'Croyne, a character the likes of which will not be seen again. I remember that during class discussion, one of my classmates made a case for how the Irish were uniquely victimized by the famine and the lack of an adequate response from London. No argument here. O'Croyne, however, perhaps contrary by nature and certainly not one to be satisfied with a simplistic nationalist spin, he pushed back. He declared competitive victimhood exercises unproductive and unenlightening. More importantly, he gravely intoned, "Listen. Survivorship means having blood on your hands. Everyone in this room is the descendant of Gumbean men, a descendant of people crafty enough or wealthy enough to have outlived their neighbors." Let that sink in. Jesus. Back in that moment, words came to a halt. If a morsel of oat bread could have dispelled the gut wrench of it all and the silence that ensued, we would have been glad for the relief. But the relief was not on offer. And some things become unforgettable even if, or perhaps because, they are difficult to articulate. With such things in mind today, I have to wonder if the popular interpretation of the hungry grass as haunting famine echo is a vernacular way for some people at certain times of reiterating Professor O'Caron's uncomfortable point. Wrapping up, whether interpreted in the light of the famine or not, the hungry grass collapses past and present to bear witness to dreadful ruptures in our obligations to each other in this society, or between us and those in the parallel society of the other world. In our attempts to understand queer notions and resonant stories that survive and circulate, there may be room to interpret the hungry grass in terms of post-memory, or in terms of the return of the repressed, or in terms of any number of contemporary metaphors for grappling with trauma and the undead past. But we are far from the first ones to undertake such a grappling. The hungry grass endures not least because generation after generation it offers itself for creative recycling and popular thinking about self and society, right and wrong, the ordinary and the extraordinary, this world and the next, a body of vernacular theory otherwise known as folklore. We do well to pay closer attention to beliefs, customs, and stories often uncharitably dismissed as backward, quaint, or trivial. Lux pennies, witch hares, the hungry grass, these may be notions inherited from the past, but survivals survive for a reason, and many of the ideas they impart have remarkable longevity and daily import. I'll leave it there. Shanae, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks very much for coming. What happens? Oh, okay. I always forget that I'm not done yet.
So questions from the audience? Allison?
Thanks very much, Ray. That was really, really interesting.
Thanks.
I was just wondering, how did you come across Packy Jim?
He's not typical, obviously. Well, in some ways, I mean, we all are a bit typical and atypical, as he says himself. But when I started doing my dissertation research in a border community in County Tyrone, this word folklore puts people off. You have to explain it or not use it, and then use it later. But when you bring up the F-bomb, they go, "Oh yeah, we don't have any of that." But we know this guy, and he lives without electricity or running water out in the mountain. And he has all these stories. And they're not wrong. He does have this stuff that we can call folklore. But what I was trying to do was a community study, and I was trying to do it at a certain time on the border. But what I would do every couple of weeks is I would go hang out with Packy Jim. And it was sort of like, over time I got to really like him. He's certainly a character. He transforms his social distance into the distance necessary to be a critic of his own society. So while he didn't fit into the first book, he needed his own book second. And it complements the first book in some ways in that the first book's a community study through the stories they tell about themselves. The second book it focuses on one person, but he gets to talk about some of the less celebratory things. But the short answer to your question, sorry, was people just said like, "Oh, you want real folklore? You got to go see Packy Jim," and they're not wrong. I mean, he had exactly what I was interested in: poaching, turf smoke, stories about smuggling. I mean, this guy lives literally on the border, and so his repertoire came to him. He was born in 1933. His repertoire came to him from all of those smugglers who would stop at their house and wait for night to fall for the unofficial economy to kick back into life. So what they're doing while they're waiting is they're telling all these stories. And so as a child, he was just soaking all of this up. But when he comes into his own, now is his turn to talk. And it's as if he's been waiting for somebody with a tape recorder for forever. Let me just add one more thing. There's what is the Miriam O'Callaghan? What's the front line? What is the name of the news magazine? What's it called? Prime Time. That's it. So a couple of years ago, a friend of mine called and said, "Hey, Packy Jim's going to be on television." I'm like, "What? Are you kidding kidding me? This guy? And apparently what they had was a story about older bachelors and how they're uniquely isolated and left behind by society. And it was, I'm not casting aspersions on journalism, but in this case, this was a form of journalism that already had this sort of like foregone conclusion, a deductive process where what they needed was an old-time bachelor. And somebody said, oh, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy. And so they packed up all of their, Mclaughlin goes out in their wellies and they bring all of the equipment and they interview him. And it was so amazing to see because they had to cut the hell out of that interview because he just kept batting their questions back. It was so wonderful to sort of see like, okay, you always wonder like, is he just this way with me? Is this just the way he is? No, he is this way with, he is a force of nature. And he wasn't going by any of their nonsense. And I don't know that there was much usable, but my God, the jump cuts that they had to do to splice it together. Anyway, nothing against Mclaughlin, but so strange that this person, my representation of him in the book is as I say in the book, is not the last word. There are many other different representations of him and the like of him throughout the world. But it was just so interesting to see a deductive version of it as opposed to one that was kind of, this was a side project for like a couple of decades. Not because I meant for it to be that way, but you know, life gets in the way. Now you're going to be afraid to ask questions. I'm really not going to go at that length on all of them, but I'm just excited about Packy Jim. Yeah. That's a great question, and that's a question I keep asking any audience if they know of correlations. Now, I do know that something very similar is recorded by John Campbell in the Outer Hebrides, so I mean, but that's sort of the same cultural area. I do know from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine who studies Japanese folklore, there's something called the Hidurogami, which is very similar, ghosts haunting a certain place where they starved to death. But I don't know of many other examples like that. So the Japanese and the, say, Gaelic world examples, I mean, I think that's polygenesis of the same idea, that the same idea comes up in two different places. There's not a genetic link. But I'd be interested if anybody knows of things like this in other parts of the world, because that comparative context is very useful. Yeah.
Would you say that the younger generation is engaged as much as the older generations in regards to the beliefs of folklore and fairies and the stories you're talking about?
Right. So that's a really good question. And I spent an entire semester unraveling that in my Irish folklore class, but I will not spend an entire semester to say that it's interesting that that kind of trope of, well, we don't believe, but my grandfather's generation believes, has been here for forever, right? I mean, it can be recorded back to like early modernity. I'm not saying forever, back to early modernity, right? So I think that belief is one of these things that you don't just turn, you either have or don't have. There's a whole lot of gray area in between. Sometimes it's very contextual. Packy Jim is a guy who says, I believe in the fairies. He says that guardedly because he knows that what you'll think of him. But the fact of the matter is he's not stupid. He's quite rational in which stories he credits as like, okay, that's just entertainment, or wait a minute, that guy wouldn't lie about that and it stands to reason. He's what Diane Goldstein would call a rational believer. So you're talking about an intergenerational thing. The other thing I would add is that the other trope that's been recorded since early modernity is like, somebody calling themselves a folklorist, or before people called themselves folklorist antiquarians, show up and say, who knows all the best old stories? People always say, oh God, you're here 10 years too late. You should have talked to so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. But the fact of the matter is what that observation doesn't take into account is that people in different life phases have different responsibilities. So it is true that when an old man or an old woman with a great deal of local knowledge dies, there's a great deal of stuff that's just been lost. I'm not saying that loss doesn't happen. But the fact of the matter is that some young people, not all young people, are listening. And when it becomes their turn, it's not appropriate for a 17-year-old to be telling these stories. But when they're maybe 50 or 60 and it's needed, then you can sort of rehydrate that knowledge. You can activate it. It doesn't happen all the time. I'm not saying there's not cultural loss, but that is a dynamic that people forget about. Like, hey, it's not the role of the young. It is the role of the old to tell these stories, and not because they're credulous, backward people, but simply to hold open the possibility that the world is not exactly the way you think it is. Most of those stories are not about, I'm trying to get you to be a credulous person to believe X, Y, or Z. I want you to just hold some space in between what you think you know and what I'm telling you is possible. Yeah.
My grandfather, it turns out all four of his grandparents left Ireland in the wake of the famine. I never knew him, but 40 years ago I sat down with one of his younger siblings and recorded a conversation with her. My point is, what I got in my memory from that conversation was she repeatedly told me these people, meaning her family, were clannish. Now, my question to you is, what is the intersection between clannishness and community?
That's a great question. So, I mean, okay, in an era before any sort of social safety network, you have to depend on something like the neighbors and family. And the funny thing is that you would think that, yes, absolutely, clannishness is a thing. I mean, we all have experienced this in some version or another. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. In Ahiyarn, I can remember going out mumming, and we were stuck for a musician, and I asked one of the guys, could we not get Charlie Logue? And he says, he just went white as a sheet. He says, we don't mix with the Logues. Okay, so there is clannishness, and in fact, one of the antidotes to that, especially in the north of Ireland, where you have, let's say you have hill farmers, Catholic and Protestant, of roughly the same class. They really have more in common than they have differences, culturally speaking. So when it comes to swapping labor and equipment and stuff like that, your neighbor forenenst your friend. That is to say, you ask your neighbor first, because your family can take advantage of you, because like you can't get rid of them, right? But there is this sort of like this kind of sense of reciprocity of like you're going to do well by your neighbor, whether the differential is they're Protestant and you're Catholic, or the differential is they're just not your clan. So I mean, I think that there are different strategies for networking. One of them is family, and especially when it's family against family. Over whatever, like the Danny Gallen, Danny McHugh sort of falling out. That stuff happens all the time because, humans. But one of the other strategy for networking is to go with somebody of a differential identity, because it's almost easier to maintain that kind of a reciprocity. Thanks very much for coming out.